was great. So now I'm going to introduce Sandy Strelu, who I met through the Writing Our History project. It was quite a pleasure. I think quarterly we met for a few years to go to San Juan Island and meet other history writers and researchers from the islands. And Sandy organized that group with Kit. And it ended up meaning a lot to me. I love whenever there's a way for islands to get together around something. It's not that common, as we've talked about. So it was fun to meet other people. But Sandy works for the town city of Friday Harbor and has a unique job and does unique work. And I'm going to let her just jump in and explain all of that to you, because I think there's different aspects that'll be interesting to different people about what she does. So, Sandy Strelu.
Great. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. Let's see, hopefully this is working. Oh, there we go. So can everybody see most of the screen, or are you still seeing everybody's faces?
I can see the screen.
Yep. Okay, good.
I can see the screen.
Okay, good. And everybody can hear me all okay?
Yep.
All right. So I'm the Historic Preservation Coordinator for the town of Friday Harbor, and this is a unique position in the county. And it's, in my opinion, it's pretty incredible that a town as small as Friday Harbor has this position at all. And I'm hired to work at 4/5 time, which means I work 32 hours a week. And there isn't, and my jurisdiction is just within the boundaries of Friday Harbor. So this is my background. I don't ever take a linear approach to very much. And so since 1980, when I graduated from college, I kind of went from one sort of community organizing job to another. I just found out I was a VISTA volunteer in rural Louisiana, and I just found out that Kathy was also a VISTA volunteer. And for those of you that don't know VISTA, VISTA was the precursor to, or it was the domestic version of Peace Corps. I worked in the Tenderloin of San Francisco with the elderly population there. I worked with groups advocating for sustainable agriculture when sustainable and organic agriculture before it really took off as it has in recent years. I worked for a documentary film company that focused on workers' issues, and I did healthcare advocacy with another group, and I finally landed working with unions, which I did for 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I represented workers, and then I was an organizer. And excuse me, while I was working at the union job, I met my husband and I moved to Oakland, and from 2001 to 2003, I was taking art classes at this art facility called Studio One, and that's what you see in the background. And this building was, now it's probably 130 years old, but it was a 100-year-old orphanage that was built after the San Francisco fires and earthquake and fire. And in the 40s, I believe, it became a community arts center. And this was part of a national movement to support art and culture among working class people. And so ever since that time, it's been this really wonderful community arts center with this whole array of different kinds of art and dance and theater that you could do. In the Loma Prieta earthquake, however, because this is a masonry and a wood building, it became seismically unsound. It was tagged. The classes continued, but the writing was on the wall that if something didn't happen, this building was going to be torn down. And so it was ironic. I discovered as I got involved with this really small, funky little group that we had to start making the case for why the art program was important, why the building was important, and that to make a long story short, there had been a bunch of bond measures in Oakland for a variety of reasons, but Studio One had always gotten left off. So finally, we caught wind of another one happening with all these different entities in the community coming together. And it was going to focus on creeks and parks. And, you know, I was just like, that's it. We're not getting left off another one. And so I got myself invited to the meeting with all these movers and shakers from Oakland, representing this little group, Friends of Studio One, and basically talked my way onto it. And for any of you who are going to be involved in trying to save buildings, I had a sleepless night the night before because I didn't know what I could offer this big group of power brokers. And the only thing we had is we had discovered that somehow we had $7,000 that we hadn't known about. And we had a mailing list of about 1,000 people. And I knew how to organize political campaigns from my life in union work. And so I came to the table and I said, look, this is what we got. We got $7,000 for educational materials. We can help get the signatures to get this on the ballot. And we know 1,000 people who care about this. And what was amazing to me is that was a big deal. And so we talked our way onto this. And to make a long story short, we were able, the bond measure was the passed by the most votes of any bond measure in the history of Oakland. And we were able to get, it passed by 73% of the voters, which is incredible. And we were able to get $10 million. This project came out over $10 million, which we over time were able to pull together, including that bond measure. So the reason I'm dragging you through that story is it was because my only claim to fame, to having any credibility around historic preservation, and that was pretty slim really, because it was more about community organizing. And up until that time, I had this little motto that I would say to myself, which was no new buildings till all the old ones are fixed up. So I'd always throughout my life really liked historic buildings, old buildings. And so right after that election, we moved to San Juan Island, which is now almost 20 years ago. And I guess I talked my way into this job as historic preservation coordinator. So here I am. So my job, I have to say that part of my job is certainly research, but really I work in the building department, and the town has a historic preservation ordinance. And if within the, roughly 2 square miles of the town, there is a smaller part of our town, which is called the Historic Overlay District. Excuse me. And if you are going to, if you need a building permit to work on an old building, to work on a not old building, or to develop undeveloped property within the town of Friday Harbor, our program says that you must go through a design review process. And it doesn't mean that your project has to be approved. It just means that you have to submit information so that your project's understandable, and then it's reviewed against historic preservation guidelines that the town has created for itself. And those guidelines are intended to try to keep the aesthetic, historic feel of Friday Harbor. So along with that, so I when there's a building permit that qualifies in the Historic Overlay District, I review it with the property owner. I write up a staff report that tries to bring in that talks about what the person is wanting to do, some of the history of the building as much as I have it, and then how it fits in with our guidelines. And then we have a 5-person board of citizens appointed by the mayor who review it and then make a decision. Does it comply? Does it not comply? If it doesn't comply, the person can still do what they're going to do. But the important point is that we've had a chance to talk to them about what the goals are for the community, and hopefully to be able to say, you know, it doesn't comply this way, but if you tweak it this way, you know, it would fit into the community better. And so a lot of times people are willing to tweak their projects. When it's new development, you know, then we're trying to influence the design. And the only time our program really has teeth is when an applicant requests to have one or both of the historic preservation incentives we have currently. And one is that you can get out of half of the parking requirement. And then the other one is you can build a little bit higher. And so and that's typically only works for infill development, new development. But we're able to then really have a guiding force to influence how construction is built. And if you ever anybody ever wants to come to the island, I'll give you a tour and we can talk about the old stuff and the new stuff and how it's worked. I will say that I always, you know, you guys live in, you know, who are in Orcas and Lopez and Shaw and on these other islands, live in places where you have beautiful historic architecture and wonderful feelings about your, you know, aesthetic qualities of the villages. And I'm always sort of amazed at how you maintain that. And thank God that you're able to do that without a position like mine or a program that would influence and assist how development happens in your communities. The other thing I do is I often, you know, I actually get calls from people from other islands who are asking advice for how should I do this? You know, I want to upgrade my building. What can I do to maintain integrity? Or are there funding that we can that I can apply for? And so I often talk to people about that. And then sometimes I get called a lot, which I always think is sort of, I get called by people who want history, and I'm always like, well, have you called the museum yet? Because really, you know, my job is really just buildings. It's not strictly family. So I try to point people in the right direction. And then we work on interpreting of and landmarking historic sites, which our landmarking program is fairly new, and we haven't actually landmarked anyone yet, but we certainly have a lot of buildings that qualify. And my hope is to start with 2 town buildings. One of them, the town of Friday Harbor building that you can see in this picture, this contemporary picture made to look old. And the other one is Memorial Park down at the harbor. So, you know, upon request, I will give guided tours. I've been involved in workshops and I've written some articles. And then I got involved with, early on, History Lives Here, which is Preservation Month in May, which is celebrated really in greater or lesser ways all over the county. And that's a time when I'm always encouraging people, if you're going to do an event around local history, do it in May. Do it in May because we want to encourage preservation tourism along with environmental tourism. And so if you want any more information about what goes on in May, feel free to give me a call. So the last 3 things I have here is, and I'm just going to go down, is I got involved some years ago with Boyd Pratt after a big barn, a historic barn burned down, to try to document the heritage barns, the historic barns throughout the county. With the idea is that if we know more about these buildings, we have a better chance to save them. And so Boyd did the legwork on measuring and documenting the physical barns, and we did a little teeny bit of thumbnail history on it. And the best, so we have survey documentation for all the barns that we knew about and had access to. And then because we wanted this information to be available to the broader community, we created this website. And now the picture you're seeing has dots that you can click on to get information about the barns, the historic barns on your island. And we put this website together a while ago, and since then, several barns have either burned down or been demolished. So there's some updating we need to do. But if you're doing local research, and it involves and the research involves a property for which there's a barn, use this as a resource. Start here, because it'll tell you how barns were constructed and what they were used for. And that's germane to putting together pieces about the person you may be researching, like what kind of farming did they do and what kind of barn did they build. So this is a resource that's, I think, a really good one, and you should check it out if you haven't already. Kit talked about History Link, and I think 2013, Liz Ilg and I decided that we should start trying to pull together people doing local history research for the ulterior motive of encouraging people to do comprehensive research about history that hasn't yet been well documented or available to the community. And my motive is I don't have the ability in my job to do really in-depth research on every building. I mean, right now, we probably are going to have 200 buildings in town that have, that are worthy of researching, and I can't research it in depth, every single building. So I thought, gosh, if we pull people together, we can tap into that great resource that is all of you. And Liz happened to went to high school with the founder of History Link. And so as the legend is now, we got together with History Link and started to collaborate, which was a really wonderful thing, because not only is History Link a really wonderful resource for local history writers, but they also helped the people who are part of our group to be able to know where to strengthen their research and their writing. And Boyd's written essays, Kathy's written essays, Lynn's written essays. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody because I'm not seeing your faces. But since 2013, the folks involved with the Writing Our History project have contributed over 40 essays to History Link. And I've got to credit History Link, because the only time I've done history on an individual rather than a building was when I did some work on Marjorie Walker. So I'll talk about more of why I hope that more of you will get involved with History Link at the end of my talk. Another thing that came up with the town was, I think 5 years ago, the town created an art board, public art board, and it's very shaped very much like the Historic Preservation Review Board. And so the town has this area called Sunshine Alley, which has really been underutilized and underappreciated until the farmers banded together and saved the last industrial building in Friday Harbor, which is today the Brickworks, which is where a lot of community events happen. It's a really successful historic preservation story, and the farmers market's there. But this alley connecting our main street, which is Spring Street, and Sunshine Alley, you're seeing half of it right now. And there was, for a long, long time, this building that I'm showing in this picture, which had these 6 boarded up windows. And so I started thinking, you know, gosh, this is great, like exhibit space. And so we talked to the owner, and it was a collaboration between the Arts Commission and the Historic Preservation Review Board to start using this space to tell history in a very visual way. So in 2018, we did this installation, which was called We Gave All That We Could. And it was about islanders throughout the county and on San Juan Island, what they did to support the war effort from home during World War I. And this had to be very visual because if you put too much text up, people aren't going to stop and look at it. So we utilize the window openings visually with more graphics and less text, and then the boxes underneath fill in the context. And this has been very successful. The next one we did was based off the research that I finally, you know, got myself to do. It took about 2 years at least to research one of the early island artists, a woman named Marjorie Walker. And so this installation went down almost a year ago. So we've had an empty space, but this was great. I felt so much satisfaction working with HistoryLink on this project and with this installation. Now you're getting to see, excuse me, the next installation that's probably going to go up within the next month or two. And this one is called, the theme is, there's a story here, exaggeration postcards imagined. So exaggeration and tall tale postcards really originated in the Midwest, and you'll know them because it would be like the train size watermelon on a box, you know, on a railroad car, or the huge trout that someone, you know, the huge trout that someone caught, or the one that got away. And, or the jackalope, that's also a big one. And exaggeration postcards extol the virtues of a place, of a commodity, which also is about the place. It's what people are proud of, is what they produce in their community, or an event. But to our knowledge, and collectors are still collecting these things. So they're, you know, they are really a part of our culture. But to our knowledge, there was never a postcard, any postcards made out of the San Juans. There were a few in Washington, but not at the San Juan. So we decided that we would take iconic archival photos from the island and build an exaggeration story around that. So this is the first panel, so you can see that the exaggeration are these huge monster sheep being herded down Spring Street. And this first panel explains what the theme is. I'm working on this project with Christine Brown, who owns the print shop here in town, and she's a exaggeration postcard enthusiast and really, you know, great with graphic design. So this is the interpretive box below the panel. So it shows the original picture, and then it talks about sheep farming in Friday Harbor. So it gives people both that funny take on the exaggeration postcard, but also gives them some history. And I realize that Spiden Island is misspelled, and I have to say this because I wanted to change it, but I couldn't get PowerPoint to let me change it. So I will change it at some point, but I get that that's misspelled. So this has been a really great way to share our history, both with islanders and with visitors. And I think that's really important. And we will continue to use this space. I think it's an idea that it can be used elsewhere. When we're done with our panels, we're giving them, like the Marjorie Walker one we gave to the museum, and the World War I exhibit we gave to the Legion. So there's a way for them to live beyond the installation year. So, you know, when I sat down to think about how to talk to you all, you know, you guys are great researchers. I think in most cases, much better than I am when it comes to genealogy work. I started thinking, well, what can I talk to you guys about? Because my starting point is buildings. And we all have an entry point. I think for most people, it's with a person. Sometimes it's an event. My entry point are buildings. And so I had to think about, what is it that buildings can tell you all? What do they tell me? What can they tell you all? So, you can, for a physical space, you can go back and figure out the homestead history. You can follow how it was subdivided, and that's a whole story in itself over time. If you started out with parcels that were 60 acres, then in modern times, those get subdivided over time into smaller bits. And you can figure out when was the building constructed in various ways, and what the architectural influences are. And I'll talk more about this. Sometimes the architectural style in rural areas like ours, we don't have really highfalutin architecture for the most part. In Friday Harbor, we have our courthouse, which was an architect designed building with a style you can recognize. And we have our first bank, which was also a masonry building, which was a big deal building. But for the most part, our buildings are vernacular. And it means, vernacular architecture means that people have taken their notions of beauty and their memories of where they've come from. And at least, from the settlement of our islands to, the 20s and 30s, people, they were usually owner builders, and those were their influences. Over the years, so when you research a site, you can also get who owned it over the years. And one of you talked about how when you're doing your research, you can't help but want to know who the neighbors were or other people. And I think that's not wasted research. That's interesting research. And who owned it over the years is also connected to circumstances of transfer of ownership. So when you follow that thread, you can get a sense of when the original or subsequent owners passed away, when they sold, who they sold it to. Sometimes they're giving it to people in their family. Sometimes it tells you that there was a death in the family, and then this property was bequeathed to other people in the family. Changes in a building over time tell us about changes in use and sort of how the evolution of our sense of beauty, and that can tell you about who made those changes, why were they making those changes, and what influenced them. So, and the other thing is how a building was used, and how that building and the community, how that community interacted with that building. And I put this building, Ernie's Cafe, up as a screen. One of the things I'm working on now with the Historic Preservation Review Board is to survey recent past, post-war, mid-century architecture in Friday Harbor. And the period of time we're looking at is from 1940 to 1980. Because for one reason is because it's so ubiquitous, most people don't think there's anything special about it. And that makes it very much at risk for change and demolition. But history doesn't stop. So there's this whole bunch of history around these buildings that we haven't captured. And I think folks following this presentation today who are from museums would probably admit that we have the museums have lots of information from, Euro settlement of the islands up to a certain point. But in recent times, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and beyond, we don't always have great documentation on that, because it doesn't seem, you guys can correct me if you want, but in my perspective is because it doesn't seem important yet. And as a person who's trying to go back and understand the history, excuse me, of these sites and of the people associated with it, I think if we don't capture it now, it's going to be so much harder to capture it later. And especially because people aren't documenting with print photography anymore. It's all digital. And as much as it is possible to save those images, I think if you really think about your own photo archives on your computers, is how are those going to be saved and made available 50 years from now? So, so we're looking at newer buildings, trying to understand now what's important, which ones are important, what's important about them and worth saving. And this particular building, Ernie's, as you can see both pictures, Ernie's is right on the runway. And so that inside picture is people can have, up until recently, could have lunch and watch planes coming and going. And the aviation history of the islands is really, really important. And some of the people associated with that history, Roy Franklin, is important nationally because he was such a leader in rural aviation. And so these airports and these structures like this sort of mid-century modern, what was the first terminal, are important because they are the physical reminders of that history. So Ernie's, the port was making plans to demolish this building, and recently they've decided not to. The cafe is not there anymore, but there's a group of people who want to save the building to make it an aviation history museum and meeting space. But you know, this has been an important building because it's the one place where pilots, both local pilots and visiting pilots, would sit down over lunch and rub elbows and tell stories and share information. As well, it was the main access point for islanders who, like me, who don't own a plane, could come and have lunch and really take in that history and be a part of that tradition. So another building that I always like to talk about, excuse me, is Vic's Restaurant. And Vic's was created in the 1950s by Vic and Margaret Reynolds. I don't know what's wrong with my throat. Hang on. Margaret comes from a long line of islanders. Vic moved here, I'm not exactly sure when, maybe the 40s, maybe earlier than that. But they worked for a variety of different businesses in town and were very loved by the community. So in the 1950s, when they wanted to start a restaurant, they could not find a bank that would loan them the money to do it. But because of their relationship with the community, private individuals loaned them money so they could start this restaurant. And this has been, and so just to step back, to the left of this building is where their house was, and where I believe where they had a kitchen garden where they grew flowers and produce that they then used in the food that they served. So, but what's, you know, this is a really humble looking building, but if this building wasn't here, I think it would be very easy for, as time passed, for people to forget about how important Margaret and Vic were. And this building, can you see my cursor moving? No, okay. So when you look at this building, the right hand side of the building was a later add-on, because when this building was built and their business started, they were a drive-up takeout restaurant. There was no place to sit indoors. You can see in this older picture, they had picnic tables outside. And what is really significant about that is that this was the first fast food restaurant, I believe, in the entire county. Now, today, we don't think very highly of fast food restaurants, but if you think about the development of fast food and its relationship to the golden age of the automobile, this was a national trend. And they were people who said, you know what, I don't know if they thought about it consciously, but they were part of that national trend. And what's really cool about this place is that later they added the area that sticks out on the right, and it goes all the way back to the back of the building. And that's the seating area. And I'm not sure what year that got built, but they made it indoor dining as well. And so subsequently, this restaurant has been a place where Islanders have been coming for birthday parties and, you know, meeting up with their neighbors and their friends for years and years. And even today, except for COVID, we can't go in because of COVID. And when they founded the restaurant, Friday Harbor was a community where everything closed down at 5 o'clock. But Vic and Margaret would stay open after football games and basketball games and dances. And they were just very, very tied to this community. And their legacy continues. My office is across the street, and I have to admit, I eat there more than I should. But it's still a really important place. And I don't know how long this building will continue to exist. Again, because just looking at this building, you can't really understand its significance historically. Now, for some of you, buildings are going to be important because they can give you information. And I'm showing this building. This is part of the research that I did for Marjorie to understand Marjorie Walker. And one of the things about Marjorie Walker that really fed my curiosity was Marjorie Walker grew up, was part of a wealthy family in New York. Her father was an industrialist in the paint and varnish industry. His brother was an architect who designed a lot of like churches and civic buildings and this house. And I was trying to figure out, why would someone who was in high society in New York find their way to live land rich and cash poor in a very rustic lifestyle on San Juan Island? And this, you know, I had this picture of this house. And one of the things that really influenced me early on, the first time I heard Candace Walker speak, was to understand that you can't really, that in order to really know our subjects, whether it's a person or an event or a place, we have to know the context of their lives. And we have to know what influenced them and what experiences did they experience. And so I believe that for some of you to look at where they lived and what they lived in and what commercial buildings they might have been part of, what kind of industries they worked in, can help to fill out that story of who they are. And at the very least, when you're putting together your essay for History Link or your book on your resource, it gives you pictures to fill out the story visually. And personally, I think that's really important and helpful. Another building that I like to use to illustrate is this building. And this is an early 1929 picture of Friday Harbor Drugstore. Now, this is the second drugstore building. This drugstore has been operating as a drugstore in Friday Harbor forever, for over 100 years. And that alone is a historical feat. I mean, how many businesses last that long? But this has been our local drugstore forever. And it started out being sort of a traditional a wooden gable roofed building on this site, on the same location. And what happened was, I don't know what the motivations are, is in around this time, in 10 years before approximately, the Panama, California exposition happened in San Diego. And I had never really, I'd always been aware of the World's Fairs and how, what a spectacle they were. And until I started researching this building, I didn't understand that these World's Fairs had these long lasting influences in architecture and art and culture and food in so many ways, because they brought other cultures to America and people could go and experience that. And so what happened at the 1915 Panama, California exposition in San Diego was it kicked off a trend of Spanish revival, Spanish eclectic architecture that traveled from the southern coast all the way up to Washington. And interestingly, stucco was never a Northwest kind of material. But if you go to places like Boise and Seattle, and certainly all over California and Oregon, there are still these Spanish revival, Spanish eclectic stucco buildings. And what I really love about this picture is that this building has been very much changed. So this is really an important picture. The belly band of this was black glazed tile, which is a very recognizable sort of Spanish revival architecture feature. The awnings cut off these transom lights. I believe that the architect, this is my guess, that the architect designed this building, but the transoms got added because it rained so much here and they wanted to keep, visitors to the business dry. But that's the only thing that explains to me why they bisected these very kind of Moorish transom windows that are still there, but are obscured by the awning and the even newer awning that was put on it. And then you can see the terracotta tiles along the top. But so you have to ask yourself, so what got into Al Nash Sr. and Leon Little to build this building? I mean, there were no other buildings in the entire county that looked like this. But they decided, but they were the types of people, obviously, that said, you know what, we're going to build something really different. And so they did. And for many, many years, I really had questions about this building, and now I understand it. And it makes me really appreciate Leon Little and Nash, because they had the foresight to build a building like this. The thing I want to point out is these circles that are just below the terracotta tile. I believe that those are sort of Scandinavian design, the art within the circles. And I think that was a tribute to the Nash's family origin. So those were added onto the building. Another thing that I think buildings can tell us about is location. Now, this is a building that's been demolished. And I've always been really sad that this building didn't make it. And I think Sean Hubbard and Leith can tell you also that their families are tied to this building. But for many, many, many years, a man named Virgil Fritz, who's the man with the cigar and the visor, he and his wife Maud lived in this building. And it's a block and a half from Spring Street. Now, Virgil Fritz was really, really significant because for 50 years, he was the town clerk for Friday Harbor, and he was the editor of the newspaper here. And so what essentially that means in my mind is that Virgil Fritz had his finger on the pulse of everything happening, not only in Friday Harbor, but throughout the county. And he reported on it and he recorded it in documents we can still read today. And what I like, and he's sitting in front of where his print shop was on Spring Street, and it was right next to where the bank was, which is now Coldwell Banker. But I have this vision of every day Virgil Fritz got up in the morning, Maud made him a really great, a really nourishing breakfast, and he walked out his door and he walked down the street and he picked up news along the way from every person he met. And that's why when you look at newspapers, it'll say so-and-so's visiting from, Spokane, and so-and-so just went down to Seattle to buy notions for their hat company. And, and I think that's a pretty good guess of what Virgil's life was like and how important it was that he lives smack dab in the middle of town, and what he contributed in his lifetime. This picture was given to me by the man who was that little boy in the picture, Jeff Fox. He doesn't live on the island anymore, but he's been really helpful in contributing in photographs. Oh, and so just because I can't help myself, when I first took this job, this pawn shop picture is the state of the house that I knew it as. And and as I got to know Virgil, I just felt like, gosh, this building really represents a lot of history about Virgil, about the town, but also about how in the development of a community like ours, Main Street is always, at least comes to be mainly almost entirely commercial buildings. It starts out having some residential, but very early on it becomes just commercial. And that's sort of the first rung of the development of a community. Outside of that, you would have homes on big, deep lots where people had huge kitchen gardens and might have a couple of animals and chickens. And it would be nestled right next to civic buildings like the Masonic Hall and across the street from the courthouse. So I think early rural communities, you can still see that development pattern, how things were kind of mixed together. And so Virgil's was one of the few, I think, 2 historic houses that were left on 2nd Street. And so I was trying to figure out any way possible to save this building. And so I went to the county and said, if we can find somebody to move this building, would you give it to them? And they said, oh yeah, because then they would save all the demolition costs and, whatever. They saw that as the right thing too. So I took a bunch of actions to try to save it. And one of the crazy things I did was, there's a magazine called Cottage Living, and I noticed in the back of Cottage Living, they always talked about an old house that someone had saved or that someone could save and make spiffy again. And so I wrote this letter to them and explained, where we live and why this building was important. And then months later, they printed this. And so it was their take on, like, gee, don't you want to save this building? Friday Harbor needs somebody to save this building. Unfortunately, though we had several people interested, the unknown costs of rehabbing an old building, especially one that had been allowed to degrade as this one had, were too much. And so eventually the building got demolished, and that was a sad day for me. Okay, so if you're inclined and you want to discover whether or not the houses, if you're lucky enough to know where the person you're researching lived, and if you're even luckier that their house still exists or the business that they built still exists, there's ways to identify the architectural style and thus the era of the building. And it varies throughout the country. And in the East, they used a lot of brick. Out here in Timberland, we used a lot of wood. But this is a good book if your libraries don't have it, I would encourage you to ask them to get it. And it's been updated recently. This is a book where you can find information that will help you start to understand the architectural style of a building if you're interested, and maybe the era that it was built. So So what I say up here is, but sometimes buildings change, and that obscures the identifiable architecture. So here's an example in Friday Harbor on Argyle. This is a turn of the century sort of Queen Anne vernacular building that had this lovely um, shingle detail and had the characteristic deep front covered porch. And those porches were really important because before the golden age of the automobile, people walked. And there was a lot of socializing that happened between the road and the porch. And so that's why you see houses of these eras having these deep porches. As automobiles became, more of a thing, those porches got smaller and smaller and, a lot of times went away. The picture on the right shows how this building has been altered. And really at this point, all you can see is, I think, I'm trying to remember if they kept the, yeah, they did keep the shingle work in the upper part of the building. And then those returns where I have the circle drawn, but they enclosed the porch and they put a balcony on it. And then the French doors at the top. And so what happens is when you look at the building on the left, whether or not you're even thinking about it, your subconscious is going, oh yeah, old building, turn of the century. I mean, you can kind of place where that building is. When you look at this building, because of the changes, it's so much harder to have that aha moment and to understand its place in the development in your community, which is why a lot of us really, and the Historic Preservation Review Board, literally begged the person who bought this building and made these changes not to do this. One of the reasons is, I mean, for me personally, is balconies are rarely ever used, but they are for some reason a selling point. And so this building was pretty radically changed. So going back to, when you're trying to understand, you have to look at a building and try to decide, like, to what extent has it been changed, what features might give me hints about when a building was constructed. Now I'm going to check the time to see how, okay. All right, so you all know a lot of resources that I use, Ancestry and newspapers.com and all of that. And so I'm just going to call out a few that I use, particularly because my job doesn't allow me to do in-depth research, unfortunately. It's the part I love the best, and I'm not able to do as much as I'd like because I have bread and butter issues that I have to do. But I'm a big advocate in social media. And I know it's a time waster, and I know there's a lot of bad things about social media. And I can tell you it's horrible for young people, and it can be a big time suck for us older people. But one of the things I've found is that if I have a question, and I know where locals tend to look, those locals who are on social media, I can throw a question out there, like throwing spaghetti on the wall, and I can see what sticks. And so this is an example of, we have a Facebook group called Friday Harbor Then and Now. And lots of longtime Islanders visit that page. A lot of other people do as well. But when I have a question, it's like it takes seconds for me to throw that question out on Friday Harbor Then and Now and see what responses I get. So in this case, I was trying to, this is Park Street, and the HPRB is focusing our recent past survey starting with Park Street. And so this is a bank, this is a contemporary bank. This is an older home. These two are historic homes, as is this one. And so I wanted, I know who built this and who lived here, both of these houses. And one of them was a man named Peter Kirk. And Peter Kirk Um, his he was an industrialist. He was responsible for founding Kirkland, Washington, and he retired here. And two of his daughters lived here as well and married into families. And what I was trying to figure out was, I know which house Peter Kirk lived in. I didn't know which house his daughters lived in, whether it was one of these two. And this one I knew because one of his daughters married Dr. Capron, and this was their house. But I wanted to get information, so I threw out a question, and I got 60 comments. Now, not everything everyone says is going to be accurate, but it gives you places to start. It gives you clues, just like not every quaking leaf on your tree on Ancestry is going to give you for sure accurate information, but it's information that you can use to then dig deeper. And so I really want to encourage people to not to use social media. And we happen to have Friday Harbor Then and Now, and I actually use my Facebook page to do the same thing. But I would venture to guess that whatever community, non-island community, your research is focused in, I think you could look at social media and find similar groups like this. And they might be a way to start getting information that you haven't been able to find yet. So I want to encourage you to not write off social media, not write off Facebook, even despite all of its ills, because it is another tool that you can use. The other tool I use a lot, especially, well, I use it anyway, when I am presented with a design review application. One of the things I always do is I go back to my files to see, well, what information do I know about that site and that house? And then the next thing I usually do is I go to the assessor's website and I use their Polaris mapping, and so I'm able to get things like the parcel number, that's the long number on the bird's eye view on the left. And I can get information of the short legal description, and that's always really important information to keep. I can get a picture of what what's there now, what it looks like now. And I can even get this, they call it a sketch, this kind of floor plan, site map of what's there now. Now, if you're going back in time, what is there now isn't always completely relevant. This happens to be my house, and this is a 1927 farmhouse outside of Friday Harbor on Baylor Hill Road. So, so this is the information that I get, and we've this is a deck we added on the side. This is a 1,000 square foot house, and it's been changed in some ways. This house started with horizontal wood siding. When we came to it, it already had shingles. The windows are white vinyl windows. So the windows themselves had been changed, but the openings hadn't. And pictures we were able to find show traditional wood double hung windows. My husband added this vent up in the peak. I actually didn't want the vent up in the peak because it wasn't original to the house, but when you're married to someone, you compromise. And so we didn't want to add on to this house. It's 1,000 square feet. We wanted the deck, so we put it on the side so it would be less visible. And those are kind of important things. Now, if you look at the picture, that's important to historic preservation. When you look at the picture on the right, where I have the circle where it's links to more information, when you go to the Polaris map, let's see if I have it better here. When you go to the Polaris map on their website, there'll be a box, and you can type, if you know the parcel number, you can type the parcel number, and the map will automatically zoom into the property. If you know the address, a lot of times it'll zoom into the property as well. Or if you only knew kind of where it was, you sort of start from that, that Google Earth picture and you keep zooming down till you get the place where you think it is. And when you find a parcel, when you click on it, let me go back. When you click on it, this box where it says 1 of 2, and I have the circle around links to more information, that's going to come up. And if you click, and then what I have circled, links to more information, the first line is search recorded documents. And searching recorded documents is really fabulous because, again, it gives you that chain of ownership. It tells you a lot of information, except in the case of the assessors here in San Juan County, they, when they digitized and put all their information online, there's a lot of information that when you click on recorded documents, they only go back a little ways. They hardly go back at all. And so to get more information about ownership, you really have to go to the auditor's files or to state archives, which is where the assessor sent all their hard copy information to the state archives. And I think some of it's in Bellingham, or all of it was in Bellingham. But if you click on view assessor's information, you're going to get this sketch that's to the left of that box, or actually, you're also going to get a picture of the property. I took this off the assessor's website. And then you're going to be able to get, they have a bunch of categories underneath. And the one I use most often is the improvement/building. And the reason I use that is because if you look down within the circle, it'll give you some information about when parts of the property were built. Now, like every other piece of information, mostly the assessor is going to be pretty right, but not always. And in fact, it was interesting to me because when I was looking at this, I was thinking, oh, they have our house built in 1935. I think our house was built in 1927. But, still, this gives you information you might not have had before. If you go up, let's see, I can't remember if I did it up here. No. Oh, so when you first click on view assessor info, you can go to building improvement and it'll give you the size of the building today. It's going to be, your buildings are going to be changed quite a lot. You can look at these maps and it gives you sort of a sense of the topography and, what, sometimes it'll give you a sense of like, wow, look, this is really big, or, there's some big parcels and then there's some that have been cut apart. And if you notice in this picture, just below the circle, see if I can move it. Whoops, let me go back up. Just below the circle where you see, let me think about this for a minute. My property is that little teeny square. It's not any of these big squares. And the circle actually, sorry about this, the circle is not where it's supposed to be. But mine is this little square that's 3527. And anyway, one of the things that I already knew, but is very graphically demonstrated, is our property was part of the original homestead of a man named Patrick Vegan, who immigrated to the United States from Ireland, and then ended up being on San Juan Island as part of the pig war of the American side. And after the pig war was resolved, he homesteaded this whole area that you see above the Baylor Hill Road area, and a little more than that. And over time, we live in the second house, Patrick Began's second house, because the first house burned down. Over time, his descendants, particularly the last Began, who had the name of Fleming, uh, was older in age, and he did what a lot of older people do, is he parceled off and sold all the property around him and just kept a little bit for himself, which totally makes sense because property is hard to maintain. And that's the property we have today. So this can even tell us a bit of a story. Now, when you click on that view assessor's information, this is the top area of property. And again, it'll give you the parcel number, which is really important. It'll give you the abbreviated legal description, which you really want to record because it'll help you dig down deeper to figure out, if you want to have information where you're going to the title company and trying to figure out, okay, what did this particular property, what did it come from? It was part of a larger property. What was that larger property? So this can help you answer those questions. And then it'll tell you, and I think this is really important, is who the owner is. And so in case you want to send me a Christmas card next year, here's my address, and here's the address of the property. So we have 316 Baylor Hill Road is the property. And then below it, we have our mailing address. And what I think this is helpful at is because if you're trying to find, sometimes if you go to past owners, you can get the owner before that, and you can get the owner before that. And you can go down this trail to try to find information. Did the owner before us end up with photographs that would be important to us? And in fact, in our case, that was the case. We started to talk to people in the area and the previous owner, and we were able to find early, not turn of the century pictures, but we were able to find earlier pictures which informed us more about the house. And so this is all good information that you can get from the assessor. I have less experience working with the auditor and working with the title company, but that's where I'm going next because I want to dig back farther, drill down farther to get more information about who owned it. And I just have to say this one story. When I first took this job, I wanted to really understand, well, the title company, what do they got in there, right? So I went to visit them, and they pulled out, and they were trying to explain to me how, their system works and what information they have. And we started with one property, and they pulled out these huge leather-bound books that were, going back to the turn of the century. And I was able to kind of look at some of the deed information. And it was one of the things that really cracked me up is one of the properties, a note from the person recording the information had recorded that the person filing the deed had said, I can't even remember what they said exactly, but at the end of it, it said, and don't tell my wife, which is like, oh, okay, what's going on here? Excuse me. So that's where I'm going to go next, is working with the auditor, working with the title company to try to drill down to find more information. So, we already use a lot of the same information, I'm sure, but I've listed the ones that I typically use at this point. And I think there are other people who are listening to this presentation who are much more skilled than I am of using other resources. And but here's ones that I use. So the top are some books that identify architecture. There's some websites to determine the age of a building and how to research a house. It's typically houses and not commercial buildings. So I've talked about the recorded information locally. And then I put the Library of Congress, and I only put this because I've only had one experience working with Library of Congress. So oftentimes, I think in your research, and certainly in mine, I came across a bad photograph of Marjorie Walker's passport. And it had enough information to tell me, where she was departing from or where she came to and other information. But for purposes of that large installation, I needed to have a higher quality photograph. And so so then I started to try to figure out, well, how do you get stuff out of the Library of Congress? Because Lord knows they have a lot of information that we want. And so I called and I wrote, and basically what I was given was this list of researchers in the DC area that you could pay to go to Library of Congress facilities and look up the information you want and get you what you want. And so I thought, well, okay, I can pay something to get, it's worth it to me to get this photograph. But what I found from their list was that two things. One of them is a lot of the people didn't respond. And then some of them weren't doing it. And then, it was just very hard. And then, and I don't know how germane this is, but then I remembered I have a friend that lives in Virginia who worked essentially for the Library of Congress, although she worked in a different area. So I called her up, and she was willing to find where the physical archive was and go there and take pictures of this. So I think you just have to be determined, and Library of Congress won't be, and maybe some of the other people listening have had an easier time than I have, but that's certainly a place to try to get information. No matter, since a lot of you are researching people who don't live in San Juan County, and if you are interested in knowing what buildings they were associated with, then most towns and cities have well, certainly historical museums with archives, but also might have landmarking programs. And those landmarking programs, which are typically not part of historical museums, but are part of the planning departments of cities and counties. So that, that might be a way you can get information. And then obviously the state archives. So Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, Chronicling America, this is, Chronicling America is if you're doing local research, the State Library, History Link, which I didn't put here and I should have. And then, yeah, so these are the resources that I use, and that I'm hoping that I pick up skills to use other resources. So I'll be even a better researcher than I am. And then lastly, what I want to say, and this is the parting message that I want to leave for all of you, is you're putting an enormous amount of time and thought and love into researching your subjects. And in doing your research, you're relying on materials and sources that other people have put together. And so I think that it's really important to pay it forward. And one of the ways that you can do that is to have confidence that you can document your research and write an essay, write an article, and put that out in the world. And I highly recommend History Link if you're doing research that's related to Washington State. But if you aren't doing research related to Washington State, consider giving back to the communities where your research subject was located. And by that, I mean, share your information, the sum total of your information when you're done with the local historical museum. Share it with, local groups, genealogy groups. Share it with the families. And one of the things I tried to do with Marjorie Walker is, when I was done with the essay, when I finally got it published, when it was finally done, I had made a commitment in my own heart that I would, because I had been so helped by Marjorie's descendants, that I would make all of my information available to them. And so I packed up all my binders, all my stuff, and I sent it to two of the family so that they could paw through it and figure out what they wanted to photocopy, with the understanding that they would send it back to me so that I could then donate it to the local historical museum. And it occurred to me, because part of Marjorie Walker's story was that she attended a prestigious girls' school that is even today prestigious private school in New York, that I would send her essay to them because her story is part of their story. And she also later, because she was an artist, went to the Art Students League of New York, which is a pretty prestigious art institution that is still survives today. And I sent the essay to them because I had used some of their information. Both of those organizations had given me information that helped me understand Marjorie. And so I made a point to send the essays to them. And I don't know, maybe it means something to them, maybe it didn't. But again, I think we do this research, and it's important that it doesn't live and die with us, that it gets out in the world so it can help enrich other people's stories and lives and research. So that's all I really want to say. If you're interested in the background of this, when the Friday Harbor post office building was built, not the current building, but the previous one, it was such a big deal that they got their own, there's a name for what this is. It's like a stamped envelope that has this space age picture of the building in space, which I've always found very endearing. And it was really a product of the World's Fair that was happening around that time and the whole interest in the space age. So anyway, I hope that any part of this was of interest to you and it will be helpful. And if there's ever anything I can help anyone with, I'm happy to do that. So thank you for listening to me and this story.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to just mention one more thing. Yes, Sandy, that was great. Thank you. And next month, Boyd will be giving a presentation, and we'll send out more details on that. He gave indication of what he'll be talking about, and it'll be March 16th, same time, same place.
Same link.
Same link, right. So thank you, and thank you to our guests too. I hope there's something that you're welcome to attend again, and it's so nice to see our stalwarts here. This is great. Thank you.